On that day, nothing unusual was happening on Earth. The sun occupied its usual position relative to the planet, and its light, as always, reached the surface 8 minutes after being emitted. The atmosphere scattered the photons, creating daylight. Climate systems operated within normal parameters, and the average temperature corresponded to seasonal norms. Humanity continued to live in complete energetic dependence on a single star, without perceiving it as a risk. More than 99% of all available energy on the planet originated from the sun, directly or indirectly. Yet this dependence was so habitual that it went unnoticed. Scientific stations monitored solar activity in the background. Radiation levels, solar wind density, and magnetic parameters remained within permissible limits. No flares, coronal mass ejections, or other signs of instability were detected. According to all existing models, the sun was perfectly stable. Orbital mechanics remained unchanged. The Earth moved along its trajectory at almost 30 kilometers per second, held by the star's gravity. The Moon remained in a stable orbit. Tidal processes occurred with calculated precision, and satellite navigation systems adjusted their parameters based on the constancy of these laws. The biosphere functioned in its usual rhythm. Plants absorbed light, producing oxygen and organic matter. Animals oriented themselves by the cycle of day and night. The human body followed circadian rhythms shaped over billions of years of evolution under the influence of the solar cycle. Even in deep space, no deviations were observed. Gravitational detectors recorded no waves, and telescopes detected no energy bursts. From the perspective of science, the universe behaved predictably. This was exactly what made what was about to happen especially dangerous. There were no signs of an impending catastrophe. The last minutes before the event were no different from any other. On the surface of the planet, the day unfolded as usual. Transport, communication, production, observations, measurements. Not a single instrument recorded the moment when conditions changed. The reason was simple. The change had not yet reached Earth. Even if the sun had ceased to exist instantaneously, information about it could not have arrived faster than the speed of light. For several minutes, the planet would still receive radiation from an object that no longer existed and would continue to move along its orbit, unaware that the force holding it had vanished. Physics does not allow instantaneous effects across interplanetary distances. Reality is always delayed. Therefore, the day truly began as usual. It was supposed to continue, and it did, right up until the last photons reached the atmosphere. What would happen next would no longer be an ordinary day. It would become the first rupture between the past and the future, the very moment later called the flash of darkness. The moment the last photons of sunlight reached Earth was marked by no external signal. No alarm sounded, no warning systems were triggered, no instant destruction occurred. From a physical standpoint, everything appeared almost trivial. The flow of electromagnetic radiation simply stopped. The illumination of the planet's surface dropped to levels impossible under natural conditions. It was not night. Even on a moonless night, the atmosphere scatters starlight. Now, however, the source of scattering had vanished completely. The sky did not turn dark, it became empty. Within fractions of a second, human vision became useless. Eyes, evolved under the constant presence of sunlight, could not adapt to absolute darkness. The space around vanished from perception. The boundaries of objects disappeared. At the same time, the influence of the solar wind ceased. Earth's magnetosphere, accustomed to the constant pressure of charged particles, began to change shape.
These processes were not yet directly perceptible, but they had already set in motion a chain of future disruptions. From the perspective of physics, the flash of darkness was not an event, but a fact, the absence of something that had always been guaranteed. Almost immediately after the light vanished, thermal changes began. The sun had provided a continuous influx of energy, compensating for the planet's heat loss. Now the balance was broken. Earth continued to radiate heat into space, but received nothing in return. In the first minutes, the temperature drop was slight and localized, yet the key point was not the absolute value, but the direction of the process, an irreversible cooling. The atmosphere began losing energy layer by layer, starting from the upper levels. Photosynthesis stopped instantly. Chemical reactions in plant chloroplasts halted, leaving ongoing cycles incomplete. The biosphere entered a standby mode for which it was not designed. In orbit, satellites continued moving, unaware that the sun had disappeared, but navigation systems relying on solar sensors and thermal parameters began producing errors. These were the first technical signs that the environment had changed radically. Darkness proved to be more than just the absence of light. It marked the beginning of a systemic failure. The most fundamental consequence of the sun's disappearance was not the cooling or the darkness, but the loss of the gravitational center. At the very moment the light ceased, so too did the force that held Earth in orbit. The planet did not stop or change direction instantaneously. According to the laws of inertia, it continued moving tangentially, along a straight line, at the same speed it had previously orbited the star. In effect, Earth ceased to be a planet in the usual sense. It became an isolated body, moving through interstellar space. These changes could not be directly felt. Gravity disappeared not locally, but globally, and so caused no jolts or shocks. Yet from this moment, all calculations of orbits, tides, and long-term stability became meaningless. The flash of darkness lasted fractions of a second, but its consequences stretched over years. From this moment, the unfolding events became irreversible. The next stage would be no mere darkness, but the loss of heat that would begin to change the planet from within.
Although sunlight disappeared instantly, its consequences were not immediate. The Earth's atmosphere still retained heat accumulated over years of continuous irradiation. The planet possessed thermal inertia, and it was precisely this that temporarily slowed the catastrophe. The last ray of sunlight was not a visible event. It could not be visually detected or separated from the previous photons. It was no different from the billions that reached the surface every second. The difference was only that nothing followed it. During the first hours, surface temperatures began to decline unevenly. Continents cooled the fastest, especially in dry regions. Oceans, with their high heat capacity, retained warmth longer, creating an illusion of relative stability. To an observer, it might have seemed that the changes were not critical. Yet the physical processes had already entered a regime in which returning to the previous state was impossible. The upper layers of the atmosphere began cooling significantly faster than the lower layers. This disrupted the usual circulation of air masses. Jet streams weakened and then became chaotic. Weather systems dependent on solar heating ceased to exist as organized structures. The absence of solar ultraviolet radiation led to the gradual destruction of the ozone layer. Previously, it was formed and maintained through photochemical reactions, which had now stopped. The atmosphere lost yet another protective mechanism, though in the absence of sunlight, it no longer played a decisive role. On the planet's surface, the first widespread ecosystem failures began. Plants, deprived of their energy source, switched to internal reserves. Yet these reserves were limited, designed to last only a few days or weeks at most. The last ray was not the boundary between light and darkness, but the boundary between a living planet and a dying system. Scientific models, previously created for hypothetical scenarios, began to manifest in reality. Temperature curves declined relentlessly. The average surface temperature dropped by several degrees during the first day and continued falling. Human technologies, reliant on stable climatic conditions, began failing. Power grids experienced overloads due to increased energy consumption for heating. Systems designed for daily temperature fluctuations were unprepared for continuous cooling. The last ray of sunlight did not bring instant death. It left time, short but decisive. It was during this period that it became clear: Earth no longer received energy from outside. All it had left was its own heat and limited resources. The next stage would not be merely cooling, but a sky without a master, where the very concept of day and night would vanish.
After the sun disappeared, the sky ceased to serve its usual function as a guide. Previously, it had been a source of light, time, and direction. Now, all these roles were lost simultaneously. Even at night, the sky was never completely black. Moonlight, the reflected solar spectrum, stars, and atmospheric scattering all created a minimal yet sufficient level of illumination. Without the sun, the moon became a dark body, and stars became almost invisible to the naked eye. Earth's atmosphere, deprived of an external light source, stopped glowing from within. The sky no longer had color. It was not blue, gray, or black. It became empty, devoid of visual depth. From that moment, humanity lost one of its oldest reference points, the celestial vault. The disappearance of the sun changed not only illumination, but also the dynamics of celestial bodies. The moon continued to move around the Earth by inertia, but without the sun's gravitational influence, its orbit began to slowly distort. These changes were barely noticeable in the first days, but inevitable over the long term. Stars, which had once served as navigational markers, no longer fulfilled their function. Without sunlight, the human eye could not distinguish them against absolute darkness. Space became invisible. Satellites in low Earth orbit continued to move, but lost an important reference for stabilization and calibration. Solar panels stopped generating energy, and the thermal balance of the spacecraft was disrupted. The sky no longer controlled processes on the planet. It became a passive backdrop, devoid of influence or structure. The loss of a celestial reference point had a profound psychological impact. Living organisms, including humans, had evolved under a clear day-night cycle. Now that rhythm had vanished completely. Circadian rhythms began to collapse. Organisms lost the ability to track time, leading to sleep disturbances, hormonal imbalances, and behavioral disruptions. This became an additional stress factor in an already rapidly changing environment. From a scientific perspective, the disappearance of the sun deprived Earth not only of an energy source, but of the center of the system itself. The solar system ceased to exist as a system. It fragmented into separate bodies, moving along their own trajectories. The sky no longer had a master. It ceased to be an active participant in the unfolding events. The next stage would no longer be the loss of a reference point, but the Earth losing its heat, a process
that could not be stopped. After the sun disappeared, Earth's energy balance became negative. The planet continued to radiate heat into space, but no longer received any from outside. This process was inevitable and governed by the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. In the first days, cooling occurred relatively slowly. The heat stored in the oceans, atmosphere, and upper layers of the lithosphere acted as a buffer. Yet even this inertia could not stop the overall trend. Surface temperatures declined continuously without daily fluctuations. Air cooled particularly quickly. Without solar heating, the atmosphere began to contract, increasing density in the lower layers. This altered pressure and the composition of air masses, which in turn affected the breathing of living organisms. Earth still appeared intact, but the processes that sustained its habitability were already collapsing. Oceans, with their immense heat capacity, became the last major reservoir of warmth. Surface layers of water began to cool, losing energy through evaporation and radiation. As temperatures dropped, water density increased and cold layers sank, initiating intense vertical circulation. This process temporarily slowed freezing, but simultaneously accelerated the overall cooling of the entire water mass. Heat was redistributed and then irreversibly lost to space. Ice began forming first in freshwater bodies, then in coastal zones of the seas. The ice cover reflected residual thermal radiation, enhancing the cooling effect, a positive feedback loop. The planet was gradually transitioning into a new thermal state, to which no existing ecosystem was adapted. The drop in temperature had a direct impact on biochemical processes. Reaction rates decreased, enzymes lost activity, metabolism slowed. For most forms of life, this meant a gradual halt of vital functions. Human civilization faced the necessity of compensating for the loss of external heat with internal energy sources. Fuel consumption sharply rose, and infrastructure designed for moderate conditions began to fail. Earth did not freeze instantly. It cooled, step by step, layer by layer. This process could neither be accelerated nor stopped. It followed the strict logic of physics. The next stage would be not merely cold, but a silence without birds when the sounds of a living planet disappeared.
One of the first perceptible signs of the biosphere's collapse was the disappearance of sound. While temperatures still allowed life to exist, ecosystems were already beginning to lose activity. Organisms dependent on external heat reduced their movements, conserving energy. Birds were among the most vulnerable. Their high metabolism required a constant energy supply, and spatial orientation depended directly on light. Without the cycle of day and night, navigational mechanisms ceased to function. Mass movements stopped. Songs that had once accompanied the passage of time vanished. The airspace became empty. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual fading, almost imperceptible at first. Silence did not come immediately, but it was inevitable. The drop in temperature accelerated this process. As cooling continued, the air became denser, and the energy required for flight increased. Even brief movement became inefficient from a survival standpoint. Insects, a vital part of the food chain, also disappeared quickly. Their life cycles were directly tied to temperature and sunlight. Without them, plants lost pollinators, and many bird species lost their food sources. Ecosystems began collapsing in a cascade. The disappearance of some species triggered chain reactions affecting others. Biodiversity declined at a rapid pace. Silence ceased to be merely the absence of sound. It became an indicator of life fading. Even organisms not directly dependent on light experienced consequences. Predators lost prey,
Herbivores lost food sources. Microorganisms lost stable environmental conditions. Forests, once filled with noise, became motionless masses. Without photosynthesis, growth halted, and metabolic activity slowed to minimal levels. Plants still existed physically, but no longer functioned as living systems. The absence of sound became one of the first qualitative changes on the planet, noticeable without instruments. Earth was transitioning from an active biosphere to a passive object. The next stage would not be merely biological fading, but the stopping of time, the disappearance of the rhythms by which the planet had existed.
The concept of time on Earth had always been tied to motion. The planet's rotation around its axis defined the cycle of day and night. Its orbit around the sun defined the course of the year. Biological, climactic, and social processes were synchronized with these cycles. After the sun disappeared, one of the key elements of this system vanished. Day and night lost all meaning. Formally, Earth continued to rotate, but without an external light source, this rotation no longer manifested in the environment. The concept of time on Earth had always been tied to motion. The planet's rotation around its axis defined the cycle of day and night. Its orbit around the sun defined the course of the year. Biological, climactic, and social processes were synchronized with these cycles. After the sun disappeared, one of the key elements of this system vanished. Day and night lost all meaning. Formally, Earth continued to rotate, but without an external light source, this rotation no longer manifested in the environment. For living organisms, this became equivalent to the stopping of time. Internal clocks, shaped by regular light cues, lost their reference point. Processes that had once been clearly divided into phases of activity and rest became mixed. Time continued to exist physically, but ceased to be perceived as a structure. Climactic rhythms also came to a halt. There was no daily warming and cooling of the surface, no seasonal changes. The atmosphere no longer responded to the planet's motion since the main energy source was gone. Ocean currents, previously driven by temperature differences, began to weaken. Without a constant energy influx, the dynamics of water masses slowed, approaching a state of thermodynamic equilibrium. Geological time, measured in millions of years, remained unchanged. Tectonic processes continued. Yet everything happening on the surface gradually fell out of familiar temporal scales. The planet seemed trapped between past and future, moving forward but without reference points. Human society felt this cessation most acutely. Social structures, schedules, biological cycles, all had been tied to the solar day. Without it, familiar forms of organization lost their meaning. Attempts to artificially maintain rhythms faced resources and technological limits. Electric lighting could only partially and temporarily replace natural light. The stopping of time did not mean instant destruction. It meant the loss of order. From that moment, changes began to accumulate more rapidly. Systems deprived of rhythm became unstable. The next stage would be the first hours without the sun, a period when the consequences would become noticeable not only to scientists, but to every living being. The first hours after the sun's disappearance marked a transitional stage between the familiar reality and the planet's new state. Changes had not yet reached their maximum intensity, but they were no longer abstract. Surface temperatures continued to fall at an increasing rate. In the absence of solar heating, cooling became a continuous process, uninterrupted by cycles. Open land areas and the atmosphere above them lost heat particularly quickly. The upper layers of air cooled faster than the lower layers, leading to unstable atmospheric stratification. Local turbulent processes began, unlike the familiar winds. These were not weather phenomena, but symptoms of a loss of energy equilibrium.
It became clear in the first hours Earth was no longer a thermodynamically stable system. Lighting from artificial sources quickly became critical. Electric light became the only means of visual orientation, yet it could not replicate the spectrum or intensity of solar radiation. Industrial and residential lighting systems began operating continuously. This caused a sharp increase in energy consumption. Power grids not designed for such loads began to fail. Solar power plants ceased generating energy entirely. Wind turbines lost efficiency as atmospheric circulation weakened. The main burden fell on thermal and nuclear sources, whose resources were limited. The first hours revealed the vulnerability of technological civilization built on the assumption of constant external conditions. Biological consequences also became noticeable almost immediately. Light-oriented organisms lost the ability to behave normally. Plants began rapidly depleting their energy reserves. Animals experienced disorientation and stress responses. Humans found themselves in a unique position. The ability to generate heat and light allowed a temporary compensation for the loss of the sun. Yet this compensation required resources that could not be infinite. The first hours without the sun did not bring death, they brought awareness. It was during this period that it became clear further developments would be measured not in days or weeks, but in hours. The planet was entering a phase of accelerated change. The next stage would be the cold that could not be stopped, a process beyond human control.
After the first hours, it became clear that Earth's cooling was not a temporary anomaly. It had entered a stable phase governed by a simple physical law. A body deprived of an energy source inevitably moves toward the temperature of its surroundings. The average surface temperature continued to fall without pause or fluctuation. Even in areas with artificial heating, the environment cooled faster than it could be compensated for. The difference between internal and external conditions grew. Open spaces proved especially vulnerable. Soil froze ever deeper, water in pipes solidified, and structures designed for moderate temperatures began to fail due to thermal stress. Cold was no longer a sensation. It had become a state of the environment. The oceans still retained significant reserves of heat, but their role gradually changed. Instead of stabilizing the climate, they became a source of slow yet inevitable atmospheric cooling. As temperatures dropped, the surface layers of water began to crystallize. Ice formed locally at first, then spread into a continuous cover. This layer insulated heat exchange, insulating the water below, but at the same time reflected residual radiation, accelerating the planet's overall cooling. Air humidity dropped sharply. Water fell as snow and frost, and then almost ceased to circulate in the atmosphere. The hydrological cycle, which had existed for millions of years, began to collapse. The cold did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated like a debt impossible to repay. Human attempts to resist the cooling faced fundamental limits. Every heat source had finite power and resources. On a planetary scale, even the combined energy of all available technologies was negligible compared to what the sun had once provided. Isolated zones where positive temperatures could be maintained became rare islands of warmth. Beyond them, the environment quickly became inhospitable to life. Cold could not be stopped or slowed by willpower or engineering solutions. Its pace was dictated by the laws of physics and the scale of the planet. From this point, further changes were no longer a question of if. Only the question of when remained.
The next stage would be frozen oceans, a moment when the largest reservoirs of heat would begin to lose their function.
For a long time, the oceans remained the last barrier between Earth and complete thermal collapse. Their vast mass and high heat capacity slowed the planet's overall cooling, smoothing the drop in atmospheric temperature. However, this reserve was not infinite. As temperatures continued to fall, the ice cover on the surface of the seas began to expand rapidly. What had initially appeared as local patches of ice transformed into continuous fields. The boundary between liquid water and ice moved steadily toward the equator. The forming ice acted as insulation, slowing the loss of heat from the ocean depths, but at the same time, it blocked any residual interactions between the ocean and atmosphere. The ocean ceased to participate in climate processes. The planet was losing its last active temperature regulator. Beneath the ice, water remained liquid for a long time. Pressure and residual heat prevented the entire mass from freezing instantly. However, convection, which had previously distributed heat, had almost ceased. Deep currents stopped. Oxygen no longer reached the lower layers, and the chemical composition of the water began changing rapidly. Marine ecosystems, even those not directly dependent on light, found themselves isolated. The freezing of the oceans did not merely mean the loss of water in liquid form. It signified the severing of global connections between the planet's layers. The hydrosphere ceased to be a dynamic system. For humanity, this stage became critical. The oceans no longer moderated climate conditions, provided access to biological resources, or participated in heat exchange. Coastal regions, once the most resilient to cold, became as hostile as continental interiors. The icy surface reflected nearly all radiation, intensifying the cooling effect. The planet's albedo sharply increased, firmly committing it to the state of a global ice body. Frozen oceans became a symbol of transition. After them, Earth could no longer return to its previous state, even in theory. The next stage would be a night lasting an eternity, a period when darkness and cold would finally merge into the planet's permanent condition. After the oceans froze, the planet finally lost all signs of changing states. Previously, even in darkness, transitions existed, daily, seasonal, climatic. Now the very possibility of such changes disappeared. Night ceased to be a phase, it became a permanent condition. Without the sun, there was no source of light capable of restoring the distinction between the illuminated and unilluminated sides of the planet. Earth's rotation no longer had any outward manifestation. Any point on the surface existed under identical conditions, absolute darkness and steadily intensifying cold. The temperature continued to decline, approaching values at which most physical and chemical processes slowed to their limits. The planet increasingly resembled a frozen object of cosmic origin rather than a dynamic system. Under conditions of eternal night, the atmosphere began to change radically. At low temperatures, gases lost their mobility. Water vapor almost completely settled as ice, and then other components began to condense. In the upper layers of the atmosphere, gases gradually precipitated. Nitrogen and oxygen, which had previously formed the basis of the atmospheric envelope, began transitioning into liquid and then solid states. Surface pressure decreased. The sky, already deprived of light, was losing its atmospheric depth as well. It was becoming increasingly empty, not only visually, but physically. Night lasted not hours and not days. It was becoming an eternity on the scale of human life.
For living organisms, this stage meant a final rupture with the conditions in which life had emerged. Even extremophiles capable of surviving at low temperatures encountered the limits of adaptation. Biological time nearly came to a halt. Reproduction, growth, and evolution became impossible. Only isolated life forms capable of entering deep states of anabiosis persisted. Human civilization now existed exclusively within artificially created environments. Beyond isolated habitats, the planet became uninhabitable. The night that lasted an eternity was not the end. It was the backdrop against which the next stage would unfold. Plants that no longer reach for the light.
Plants were the foundation of nearly all life on Earth. Through photosynthesis, they converted solar energy into chemical energy, forming the base of food chains and maintaining the composition of the atmosphere. After the disappearance of the sun, this function lost its meaning. Photosynthetic reactions stopped instantly, but the plants themselves did not die immediately. Their tissues still contained reserves of carbohydrates accumulated over years of existence. These reserves allowed minimal life processes to continue. However, without an external source of energy, growth ceased completely. Shoots no longer elongated, leaves did not unfold, roots did not expand their feeding zones. Plants froze in the state in which the last light found them. Light was no longer a guide. It ceased to exist as an environmental factor. As temperatures fell, biochemical processes slowed ever further. Enzymes lost activity. Transport of substances within cells became increasingly difficult. Even the consumption of internal energy reserves proceeded more and more slowly. Many plants entered a state close to dormancy. Seeds and spores proved to be the most resilient forms, capable of persisting under extreme conditions. Yet without any prospect of light returning, this was not waiting, it was preservation. Forests, fields, and oceanic phytoplankton communities ceased to function as ecosystems. They became frozen structures, deprived of exchange and renewal. The planet retained a green memory, but not green life. The disappearance of active vegetation had delayed but profound consequences. Oxygen production stopped. Although its reserves in the atmosphere were substantial, without replenishment, they became finite. Soils ceased to form. Organic matter was no longer renewed. Microbiological processes collapsed. The carbon and nitrogen cycles came to a halt. Plants no longer reached for the light, not because it had vanished visually, but because the very idea of growth had lost its meaning. The next stage would be planetary hunger, the moment when the consequences of halted photosynthesis would reach every level of life. Hunger on Earth did not begin with empty warehouses or food shortages. It began earlier, at the moment when energy production within the biosphere ceased. Without photosynthesis, no new organic matter was being created. All existing food chains relied on past reserves. Herbivores consumed the remnants of plant biomass. Predators consumed herbivores. This process could continue for a limited time, but it was not being renewed. Even in the cold, living organisms continued to expend energy. Every breath, every movement, every biochemical process required resources that were no longer replenished. Hunger was not an event, it was a function of time. The most sensitive links in ecosystems disappeared first: small animals, insects, plankton, organisms with short life cycles and high metabolic rates. Their loss disrupted balance even where food reserves still remained.
Larger animals endured longer, but they too faced the inevitable. Plant mass was not regenerating, and a shift to alternative food sources was impossible. Humans, possessing technologies for food storage and processing, gained a temporary advantage. Canned goods, frozen food, and grain reserves made it possible to delay the crisis. However, the global logic remained unchanged. The planet no longer produced food. As reserves were depleted, food ceased to be a matter of choice or economics. It became a physical limit of survival. Even within isolated environments, sustaining life demanded ever greater energy expenditure. Attempts to create closed biological cycles ran into hard limits. Artificial lighting could not compensate for the absence of the sun's spectrum and intensity. Synthetic food production required energy that was steadily running out. The planet's hunger was not chaotic. It was a strictly ordered process, following the cessation of photosynthesis. The next stage would be humans in underground shelters, the civilization's response to the biological limit of Earth's surface.
As Earth's surface became increasingly uninhabitable, survival began to shift downward. Underground spaces were initially used as temporary protection from the cold, but soon they became the only stable environments. Below ground, temperature changed more slowly. Heat stored in rock formations was retained longer than on the surface, making subterranean structures more resistant to extreme cooling. Existing tunnels, mines, bunkers, and technical complexes formed the foundation for shelters. They were upgraded, deepened, and interconnected, creating closed systems. Life gradually withdrew from the surface, leaving it frozen and empty. Underground shelters required complete autonomy. Air, water, energy, and food had to be produced or recycled within closed loops. Any leakage meant a loss of resources. Life support systems operated at the limits of their capacity. Air and water recirculation became mandatory. Organic waste was processed with maximum efficiency, as no new sources existed. Artificial lighting sustained minimal biological rhythms, but it was only a surrogate for sunlight. Psychological strain increased as the external environment became inaccessible. Shelters ceased to be a temporary solution. They became a new form of existence. Not everyone could enter the underground complexes. Limited space and resources led to selection based not on moral principles, but on technical feasibility. Social structures transformed. Priority was given to specialists capable of maintaining life support systems. Hierarchies became functional. Underground, humans preserved warmth, air, and relative stability, but the price was high: the loss of the open world. The next stage will be new laws of survival, rules shaped not by culture, but by the physics of closed systems.
Under the conditions of underground shelters, familiar social norms quickly lost their relevance. The environment no longer allowed for redundant systems. Everything that did not directly contribute to survival became secondary or disappeared entirely. Energy became the primary limitation. Lighting, heating, air filtration, and food production all depended on it. Every process was evaluated in terms of cost and return. Efficiency became the main criterion for decision-making. For the first time in human history, survival became a task not of the individual, but of a closed system. A single mistake could lead to failure for everyone. Laws were no longer written as abstract rules. They were derived from the physical constraints of the environment. Resource distribution became strict. Food, access to heat and light were rationed.
Excess consumption became impossible. It directly threatened the stability of the shelter. A person's role in the system was defined by their function. Skills related to maintaining equipment, controlling the environment, and optimizing processes were valued above all other qualities. Education became applied and narrowly specialized. Time also changed its meaning. Without external reference points, it was measured by system cycles and shift rotations. Biological rhythms adjusted to artificial signals. Survival ceased to be a right. It became an obligation to the system. Psychological pressure intensified. Confined space, constant scarcity, and the awareness of irreversibility shaped a new perception of reality. Hope was replaced by calculation. Moral dilemmas were resolved pragmatically. Decisions were made not from the perspective of a desired future, but from the standpoint of minimizing losses in the present. The new laws of survival were not debated. They were followed because no alternative existed. The next stage will be the fear of darkness, not as the absence of light, but as the constant presence of the unknown, penetrating even the protected spaces.
The darkness on Earth's surface became absolute, but the fear of it was not confined to the external environment. It penetrated the underground shelters as well, where light existed only through the continuous operation of systems. Artificial lighting was not constant in intensity. Any malfunction, any drop in power immediately served as a reminder that beyond the lamps lay complete, orientationless darkness. The fear of darkness ceased to be a primitive reaction. It became an awareness of vulnerability. Even brief power outages triggered panic, not because of the inability to see, but because of the threat of losing control over the environment. The human psyche evolved under conditions in which darkness was always temporary. Now it had become the background of existence. This altered the perception of space and safety. Underground corridors seemed endless. Sounds echoed off the walls, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. Deprived of natural reference points, the brain amplified its response to the slightest stimuli. Darkness no longer meant rest or sleep. It meant the loss of boundaries between the real and the imagined. Fear became a factor that had to be considered alongside technical parameters. Shelters were designed to minimize unlit areas. Light cycles were introduced to simulate the alternation of day and night. Even so, fear could not be completely eliminated. It was sustained by the knowledge that beyond the shelters there was nothing but cold and emptiness. The fear of darkness was not irrational. It was a logical consequence of the conditions of existence. The next stage will be the last cities, remnants of human civilization operating at the very edge of technical capability. The last cities no longer resembled the familiar megacities of the past. They did not grow or develop, they contracted. Space was used in a strictly functional way, and everything superfluous was gradually shut down and preserved. Cities formed around stable sources of energy: nuclear reactors, geothermal zones, deep thermal reserves. These determined where human presence could still be sustained. Surface streets were abandoned and buried under ice. Active life moved to underground levels connected by tunnels and technical shafts. Architecture was governed not by aesthetics, but by thermal and energy efficiency. The city ceased to be a space for living. It became a mechanism for survival. The population of the last cities was strictly limited. Every additional person meant an additional burden on life support systems.
Numbers were maintained at a level where balance could still be preserved. The production of food, air, and water took place in closed cycles. Any failure had a cumulative effect. As a result, cities became extremely cautious systems, avoiding abrupt changes. Culture transformed. Art, science, and education existed only insofar as they helped maintain stability. Information about the past was preserved in archives, but it did not define the present. The last cities lived not for the future, but in a continuous present. Connections between cities were minimal. The movement of people and resources was risky and energy-intensive. Each city became an almost autonomous unit. Earth's surface no longer connected humanity, it divided it. Distances were measured not in kilometers, but in energy costs and probabilities of loss. The last cities were islands of warmth in an ocean of cold. They existed in spite of the environment, not because of it. The next stage will be hope in artificial light, an attempt to replace the lost star with created sources of energy and meaning.
Artificial light became not merely a technological element, but a symbol of continued existence. It replaced the sun wherever possible, in shelters, cities, and production zones. Light sources were no longer used for comfort. Their spectrum, intensity, and duration of operation were calculated with high precision. Every photon carried an energy cost. Light cycles imitated the lost alternation of day and night, supporting residual biological rhythms. This helped preserve psychological stability and organismal functionality. Light became a tool. It ceased to be the natural background of life. At the same time, attempts were made to create artificial analogs of solar energy. Experimental reactors, fusion installations, and high-efficiency heat sources were considered potential replacements for the lost star. However, the scale of the problem was disproportionate. Even the most powerful installations could supply only local zones, not the entire planet. The energy deficit remained fundamental. Nevertheless, artificial light made it possible to preserve isolated ecosystems. Hydroponic systems, microalgae, and synthetic food chains ensured minimal biomass production. Hope existed not in restoring the past, but in sustaining the present. The symbolic meaning of light proved no less important than its practical function. It became a sign of life, human presence, and control over the environment. Every illuminated area was a declaration. Here there is still warmth, air, and reason. Beyond it began a zone where the laws of human existence no longer applied. Hope in artificial light was fragile. It depended on resources, discipline, and uninterrupted operation of systems. The next stage will be humanity on the brink of extinction, the moment when even these islands of light begin to shrink.
Over time, it became clear that even the most resilient systems were not eternal. Resources were being depleted slowly but inexorably. Fuel, materials, spare components, everything had a limit that no engineering solution could bypass. The number of functioning cities declined. Some lost their energy source, others their structural integrity, still others the ability to maintain closed cycles. Each disappearance occurred without external drama, like a localized system failure. Humanity's total population continued to shrink. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual compression of the population toward the minimum viable numbers. Humanity was approaching its physical limit, defined by environmental conditions rather than culture or will. The remaining communities faced a choice that could no longer be postponed.
Maintaining population size came into conflict with preserving system stability. Every new human increased the load on the systems, shortening their total operational lifespan. Decisions were made on the basis of calculations, not hope. Reproductive programs, demographic planning, and strict limitations became part of everyday reality. The knowledge of the past was preserved, but no longer as a tool of progress, rather as an archive of a vanishing species. Human history ceased to be a story of development and became a story of preservation. Humans no longer strove for expansion, they strove for continuation. The boundary between survival and extinction became thin and unstable. Any mistake, any chain of failures could become irreversible. For the first time in history, the existence of the species depended on the stability of a few dozen isolated systems. During this period, the idea of a global future disappeared. All that remained was local continuation, sustaining life here and now without guarantees. Humanity stood on the brink of extinction not because of a single catastrophic moment, but because it was unable to compensate for the loss of a fundamental source of energy. The next and final stage will be the world after the sun, a state in which Earth and humanity will ultimately define their form of existence or disappearance.
Over time, the concept of after lost its meaning. The sun did not return and could not return. Its absence became a fundamental condition of existence, not an exception. Earth had finally ceased to be a planet capable of supporting life as it was once known. It had become a cold body drifting through interstellar space with residual heat trapped deep beneath the surface. The atmosphere existed only fragmentarily. Most gases had settled as ice, covering the surface with layers of frozen deposits. Oceans were locked in ice for kilometers deep. Geological processes continued, but they no longer affected conditions for life. The world became stable in its immobility. If humanity continued to exist, it did so only in isolated pockets. They resembled not a civilization, but biological capsules, closed systems sustaining life for the minimally possible time. In these environments, humans no longer perceived themselves as masters of the planet. They became part of it, temporary, fragile, and dependent. Ambitions gave way to maintaining equilibrium, and the future was measured not in generations, but in the lifespans of systems. The possibility of restoring Earth's surface was not considered. There was no energy for it. The only question that remained was, how long could this state endure? The world after the sun was not entirely dead. It was almost empty. From the perspective of the universe, the disappearance of the sun was not an exceptional event. Stars are born and die. Planets freeze and crumble. The only difference was that on this planet, a mind existed capable of understanding what was happening. If humanity disappeared, Earth became just another cold object among billions of others. If it survived, even in its minimal form, it meant that life could adapt to conditions beyond its origin. The world after the sun offered no answers. It recorded an outcome. History did not end with an explosion or a flash, but with a long, cold continuation.